My name is Bre Hamilton, and I live in Nova Scotia, Canada, actually on the ocean. And today I'm going to be talking about the story of growing up in a toxic religious cult and how I was able to eventually leave, and not only leave, but start to begin and continue to heal from the religious trauma that I experienced growing up for like over 20 years. So I grew up in Ontario, Canada. I was the second born to my parents. They ended up having 9 kids. My parents were part of actually starting a Christian school. So they kind of got in contact with other people and they all decided they were going to start this Christian school together. And throughout the process of starting that Christian school, they met this couple who ended up becoming our local pastor and his wife. And so, at the time, my parents felt like it was divine that they met this couple and that they were really aligned with the belief systems that they had and that they were starting a church with. So when we started going to the church, it was just in the pastor's house, like in his living room. It was very, very small. And there was just a few families. But as I said, our family had 9 kids. There were other families that were also having big families. And so pretty soon we outgrew the living room and ended up, for the rest of the time that I was a part of the church, and I believe they're still there, in a school gym. And the church that we went to was affiliated with like a bigger umbrella of the churches, and they were based out of like in New York State. And so the head of that church, that was the person that everybody that was a part of this denomination, this church organization, considered him to be a prophet. Basically what he said goes and whatever. So without like getting into all of the stories over the years, this pastor purportedly went to heaven and hell a couple times, right? Died, went to heaven and hell. And so like, how do you argue with someone who's supposedly been to heaven and hell and seen all sorts of things, right? So everything was very much taken on as like extra biblical revelation. He wrote books about it. And so that really enhanced what started off as like this set of beliefs that really kind of like took on a whole different life of its own. And there was a lot of rules and regulations in place, especially if you were a girl. There was a lot of emphasis on, like being submissive and meek and, modest, wearing certain kinds of clothing, interacting with the opposite sex in a certain way or not at all. There's a lot of separation. So if we would be at like church camp or something, we had to like swim separately from the boys. If we were on the worship team, so if we played an instrument or sang or did any of that stuff, we had to, abide by, like we had to wear a certain length of skirt. If we didn't wear that, we'd have to put a blanket over our laps, things like that. And the music was also very like censored. Like you wouldn't have seen drums ever at that church. Like it was very much like strings and piano and singing, and that was it. And there was just a lot of like sort of fundamentalist belief systems there. We were kind of like not affiliated with, but kind of alongside of, like, a lot of people have probably heard at this point about the IBLP and all of that stuff that came out with the Shiny Happy People documentary and the Duggar family and the church that they were attached to. So we actually ended up having a family that was kind of like affiliated with them, and part of the ATI seminars and stuff came when I was a teenager. And so a lot of that stuff started filtering in and kind of meshing and merging with like everything else that we already had going on. Growing up in this environment, obviously we trust our parents, we trust the things that we're taught. So there was definitely a lot of the, like, this is truth. I don't really know anything different. It wasn't really until we started getting older and interacting with kids that weren't from our church, that weren't from that denomination, even other Christian kids from other churches, where it was like, oh, I guess like we're more strict. And like we were homeschooled a lot also growing up. And so there was that. And but the other people in the church were also. So it wasn't weird till we started interacting with people outside of it. There was a big emphasis on like corporal punishment. There was fear. It wasn't really respect. There was just a lot of like fear of parents and fear of the leadership in the church. And everybody kind of did that. That was also normalized. It was like spanking is normal, and people calling children's aid on people who spank, those are the bad people. And so there was a lot of that built into it too, right? It took me a long time to deconstruct from that after leaving, even after I initially left the church, to start to like recognize that there was like stuff out here about how how to raise children in a healthier way and like how damaging this was and how long lasting those effects are. Growing up though, I did have a sense that there were certain things that like, I wonder why we believe that. Like, why do we not think that it's okay for people to be gay? Or why is there this like emphasis on you should only marry like other people from your race? There was part of me that just knew that stuff did not align with me and like I didn't resonate with it at all. However, having said that, I was definitely always seen as like a black sheep or a rebel or like the one that just didn't, fall in line. So, even as like a younger kid, I would try and be pretty wild, and that was kind of like they, tried to discipline that out of me. And then, later on as a teenager, there was like different tactics were used then, right? Because then it would be more about like shaming the way in which I was behaving or like comparing me to other girls in the church who were more submissive to their dads or who were falling in line more and like doing things what seemed like more easily than I was able to do. And so there was a lot of like spiritual gaslighting and manipulation that kind of went on then. And later on when, I got pregnant, I wasn't married. There was also like this whole thing where when I came back to the church, because there was a lot of like in and out for me until I was about 26. And so when I had come back to the church after I had married this guy and had another kid with him, I had to like stand up and apologize to like the whole congregation because I had been a bad example to the other kids in the church of like, basically I was telling them like, my life is what not to do. Don't do it. Listen to the church. Respect your elders, be submissive, all this stuff. And that was like a prerequisite for me being able to like go again to church events in New York State. I was not allowed to go and do those things until I had like repented to the church and repented to the pastor and all the people that I had supposedly harmed. Technically, it means that there's no questions asked. If they say jump, you say how high. At a certain point, there's nobody above that person, right? And so eventually you run out of accountability in the leadership. But when you're like way down here and it's like, okay, your parents, then your pastor, and then it's like the head pastor and it's God. So it's like when you believe that like, you might go to hell or like this is about your soul, there is this level of like manipulation that can happen from those people because they know that you still believe that. So they can use that to the advantage of like getting you to do what they want you to do. And I do want to say that there are some players in this story that were, just as much stuck in that whole system as I was. I do see ways in which my parents were stuck in that, especially my mom. And like leadership, obviously, I would say was very part of the gaslighting and manipulation that was happening. Whether it was intentionally harmful or not, that's what happened, right? And so when I'm talking about like, I had to repent to the pastor, like, I had to write letters and I had to stand up in front of the church and I had to have a meeting with the pastor and his wife and my parents and like literally just verbally tell them like how sorry I was, how much I regretted my actions, things like that. So even though I didn't really understand like the need for this like excessiveness at the time, I did feel bad about the way things had gone because, the person that I ended up marrying was like not a good choice. And so that was like a normal like life regret kind of thing that got mixed up with, it's because I didn't submit to my parents. I didn't submit to God. I didn't submit to the church. And so now I'm being punished for that. And I need to like take these steps in order to get back in line. There was what I would call it physical abuse now because everybody was spanking their kids. I didn't think of it as abuse at the time because everybody was spanking their kids and it came from the Bible. So we were supposed to do it. God said, even if the government says we can't do it, we have to do it because God said so. As far as like other abuses, there was definitely like emotional and spiritual manipulation going on. It's hard to like necessarily say, there was like this one specific thing because it feels looking back like it was a normal thing for there to be this sort of spiritual manipulation going on where, you're preying on somebody's belief system. And in some cases, like with kids who are growing up in this, that belief system has been ingrained by you also. So everything that they believe is because of stuff that you've told them. And now you're also like using the stuff that you've told them and the stuff that they believe so strongly in to control their actions, to control the ways, that they live their life. And I remember this is like a pretty big story that I share now. When I was 20, I got pregnant with my first child. and I was about 8.5 months pregnant, and I had, had my own apartment. I was on maternity leave, and I had like done some of the like setting up stuff with my mom. She was like, coming around and like being a little bit better than things had been. And she was coming over to my apartment and helping me set things up for the baby that was coming and like getting baby clothes and things like that. And then there was this ordination ceremony happening at one of the churches in New York, and the head pastor was going to be there. And so it was like, oh, like, let's go see. But they had this plan in their back pocket to get me into the church office, so like basically have an intervention with me. It came out that they all believed very strongly that I should give this baby up for adoption. And remember, I'm 20. I was 21 by the time she was born, so I wasn't 16. I had been planning for this baby financially, physically, like in all the ways. I had my own little apartment. I was supporting myself. I wasn't looking for financial help from them or the church. Anyway, so they got me into this room and totally like blindsided me with this conversation. And I felt, I wasn't even mad about this head pastor because like he was just doing whatever he thought was right. But I felt very betrayed especially by my mom. And that was like a big piece of like mistrust in those people, and also mistrust of the church in general, like leadership and the church. And because that was very traumatic for me, I just remember like, I was just crying. I was so young. And then, he would say like, I don't even understand why you're crying. Because in his mind, this was a black and white situation. If you give this baby up for adoption, you won't be tied to the father anymore. And then you can get back to the life you're supposed to live, which is going to Bible college. For me, it was obviously not black and white. And I don't really believe that that was the life I was supposed to live, because how I view things now, things that had happened that led me to becoming a mom were what was supposed to happen. And that was, when things began to shift for me. And so, I kind of just like bided my time. I was crying most of the night. My parents brought me back that night, I believe. And I like immediately went up to, my then boyfriend's parents' place, because I knew like they would support me in keeping the pregnancy. And I just needed like people in my corner at that time. There's been a lot of healing from that since then. And my mom has since apologized, but that was a pretty big moment for me in like feeling abused and trying to be manipulated by the church in like what felt like the biggest way possible, and standing on my own feet and being like, nope, that's not right. I'm moving forward with what I know is right for me. So even though I didn't have a lot of the healing of like being able to support myself and have my own back and the tools in my back pocket that I do now, I look back with like such awe at that version of me who, even without all that stuff, knew what was the correct path for her and took it. When I like first left my family, and like when I was 20, that was really hard for me because I left a lot of younger siblings behind. And my youngest sibling, I believe he was 8 at the time, and I were quite close. And that really changed the relationship. But then the church kind of cut off my contact with the family. So I wasn't able to have the conversations with my siblings that I really wanted to have. There was obviously lots of them that I couldn't have like talked them into leaving then or anything, because they were all like minors, and I didn't necessarily like have any kind of setup to be like, hey, come live with me for a while. But since everyone has like grown up and stuff, we've definitely had lots of conversations about the church that we grew up in. Some of the family are still Christians and go to other churches that I would say are much healthier church experiences. And, and then some don't go at all. But we've had lots of conversations, and we've been able to like even make amends for things that happened back then. Like, for example, I know that my youngest brother felt like I kind of abandoned him, which, he gets it now. But like at the time, he was an 8-year-old kid, and all of a sudden I was gone, and it was as if I didn't even care about like being there or like seeing him. But, the reality was I wasn't allowed to be alone with my sibling because, I might leech some evil spirits onto them or something. So we've had lots of really good conversations, and we've all stayed fairly close. We're kind of all over the map geographically, but we have like a family WhatsApp group and stuff, and we have lots of talks. And yeah, I think that's been very healing for us to be able to kind of reflect on like what happened to us. And we've all come away from it in different ways. Like, I definitely still feel very much like the black sheep outlier. I'm definitely like the least conservative. I'm not Christian at all, so the least Christian. And, I just do life very differently at the point now where like that doesn't necessarily make anybody like, oh, I can't talk to Bre or whatever. Like we still all have a fairly close relationship. It is really interesting because I often kind of look back at it and like, I wonder what was the purpose? Like what did they get out of it? You know, like I know that for some of the players, it's definitely like they're so bought in that they truly believe this is like an eternal damnation level conversation. And so if you are worried about somebody's soul, then I guess you're not going to shut up about it. But it's hard to know, like the head pastor has since passed away, like within the last several years. And it seems like the cult is kind of imploding because of that. So someone else ended up taking over his position. And I don't know if that just hasn't gone well or what's going on, but a bunch of people have recently left the cult and now are like, oh yeah, he was a false prophet. And, you know, and it's like, no way. So like for me, I've been out of it so long, it's just like, wow, it took you guys a really long time to see that. But at the same time, I'm thankful that that's happening and people are starting to see it for what it really is. And, you know, hopefully that results in lots of healing with all, you know, the people they're connected to as well and their kids. Hopefully, you know, some of them have grown kids that they raised in that and that like don't have a very good relationship with them at this point, because a lot of times it's very hard for the parents in these scenarios, because if they admit the wrongdoing, there's a ton of guilt and shame attached to that, right? That then they have to acknowledge the harm they've caused, and like, so it spirals into this whole thing. And so like for my mom to apologize was like, it sounds like, oh, that's nice, but like that was a really big deal for her to apologize to me and to go back and be like, I can't believe the way I handled all of that, or the things that I did and stuff. Although to me, like I truly believe my mom was a victim as much as anyone else. Most of the wives, I would say that. And like some of these adults now that are leaving are like trying to say like, oh, adult kids, please understand that your parents were only doing their best. And I always talk about that because it's like, yes, we all do our best as parents and we are going to make mistakes. The way that we handle that is not by just like brushing under the rug and saying, well, we were doing our best, sorry. But we have to actually acknowledge the harm that we've caused. There were ways that I started out as a parent because I was still entrenched in the religious trauma. I was still, you know, being sucked in and out of the cult, that in the early years, especially of my 3 older kids, specifically the older 2, there was a lot of ways that I was showing up as a parent that like I look back on now and I'm just like, oh my gosh, that was so horrible. But we've had conversations. I've had conversations with the kids, like, I'm so sorry for the way that, you know, I did this thing or did that thing. And I have a very close relationship with my kids. They talk to me about a lot of stuff, and I have some teenagers and preteen and then a toddler. So we have kind of the whole spread of ages here right now. But it's just very interesting then, you know, to see the contrast of how I'm able to raise my youngest now versus the kind of parent I was when I was, you know, 21. So kind of how I'm using my own story to help other people is I share a lot about how when we lived up north in Ontario, Canada, so this is like just prior to the pandemic, I really just had like an experience with my oldest that kind of like kicked my butt into gear, where it was like, what am I doing? I'm just living out of default. Like I have no intention. Like I'm just like living from this unhealed version of myself. And so it really like pulled my head out of my butt and started me on the path of like intentionally healing, intentionally deconstructing. And I think a lot of people, you know, they leave the church and it's like, okay, good, I got out. But that's really like when the work starts, is once you have pulled yourself out of that environment. And there's no shame if, you know, it takes you some time, because like that's what happened with me. I left the church and it was a number of years before I really became aware of how I did not like the way I was showing up as a parent, the way I was showing up in life just as a person, and you know, really wasn't like living out of any sense of purpose or any kind of intention. And so that's really what I want to help people with, is like, I'm not necessarily helping people to leave the cult, but I'm helping people who have left and who have kind of recognized, oh my gosh, like I'm just like living out of this default place, like I'm out of that environment. But a lot of the stuff that I do is still tied back to the conditioning that happened then. And I know that I still feel spiritual, but I know that like whatever kind of spirituality that is not what I want. And so it's like really rediscovering, like, what does spirituality mean to you? What does like God or source or universe mean for you? You know, for some people that might just be connecting with nature, you know, the ocean, the grass, the trees. And for other people, it might be like witchy stuff. There can be any like whole realm of things. when we're talking about spirituality, but like, what does it mean for you in a really healthy, grounded way that feels right for you to express your spirituality? And then how can you connect to your intuition, connect to your values, to start to really see the vision that you might have for who you want to become or who you are becoming? It starts with really recognizing what our values are that might be different from what we were told our values should be. Like, what are they really for us, and how do we start living from that place and like moving toward that bigger vision that we have for our life, whether that's like, you know, a big huge purpose of like somebody wants to share their story on stage, or maybe it's parenting your kids in a completely different cycle breaking way than how you were raised. I am running a group coaching program starting in October. So if this is resonating for folks and they want to reach out and talk about that, I'm more than happy to hop on a free call and just talk about what the program is and how it might be helpful for someone. And you can kind of figure out if it's like the right next step for you. And then I also do have like a low cost membership as well for people who maybe just want to like dip their toe in and see what things are all about. And then like for the most part, people can just find me over on Instagram at Soulfully Bre as well. And all the information is over there.